Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Brown Bag Lunch. My name is Dia Nagaraj, and I am the Albert Ravenholt Curator of Danish American Culture here at the museum. This Brown Bag Lunch series is sponsored by the generosity of Dennis Anderson. Today, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Lindsey Row-Heyveld from Luther College, who will be speaking to us about Beowulf. Dr. Lindsey will also be here tonight, actually, for a lecture on the intersection of Nordic culture, Nordic symbology, medievalism, tattoo culture, and white supremacy. So please feel free to join us tonight as well. We'll be serving a light dinner at 5, and then the lecture starts at 6:30. So with that, I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It is so lovely to be here. I grew up in Southeast Nebraska, and I finished my PhD at the University of Iowa, and now I live in Decorah. So anytime I visit my family, I spend a lot of time on 80, and for years, I've seen the billboards, the Danish windmill billboards, and have yet to come. So this is my first visit. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited. I'm especially excited this afternoon, both for the lecture on tattoos, but also because my dear friend, Lisa Kildegard, translated all of the Louis Jensen square stories that are out in the exhibit. So I've been hoping to have a chance to go see those. I know it can seem a little odd to talk with you about England today when we are here at the Museum of Danish America, but I promise that we'll all become clear. We're also going to be talking about Beowulf, and I want to say from the beginning, if you have never read Beowulf, or if the last time you read it was in 9th grade, many, many moons ago, you will still be able to follow along. I have set it up with the expectation that, the details of Beowulf are not like front in your mind. So I'm actually going to start with a quick refresher on Beowulf, if you've never read it or if it's been a while. Beowulf is a very lengthy narrative poem written in Old English, probably sometime in the late 700s, possibly as late as the 1100s, but in all likelihood, late 7, early 800s. It's the story of a warrior, Beowulf, who defeats a series of 3 monsters, 2 in his youth and 1, a dragon, in his old age. It was written down at the very beginning of written English, and from an era where there's relatively little to base our knowledge about this time period on. There are few written records, there's very limited archaeological evidence, so a text like this is foundational for a couple of important reasons. One, in some ways it serves as the initiating work of literature in English. And also, it is one of the primary sources used to understand, if not the reality, at least the values and aesthetics and dreams of this place and time. But what is the place and time of Beowulf? That would seem like a relatively easy question to answer, but today we're going to talk about how it's actually much more difficult than you might think. So, in order to understand this seminal work of English, quotation marks, literature and culture, we need to know something about early British history. And the most important thing that you need to know is that Britain is an island. Now, this might seem very obvious, and it can be, but I want you to remember what it means that Britain is an island. Although we today think of Britain as hugely historically important, both because it is sort of, as Americans in some ways, our ancestral home, even if it is not our literal ancestral home, because it is the country that colonized North America, and because we are all English speakers and it is the source of our language, it occupies a really big sort of space in our memory and imagination. But for most of Britain's history, it was literally marginal, on the edges of continental Europe, both in terms of its geography and its social importance. In fact, it's important to think about what it means, especially in relationship to Nordic countries, which we'll get to in a moment. part of my thesis for today also has to do with the fact that as an island, there is no part of the history of Britain that isn't also the history of being conquered. Until Britain itself became the power that took over the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was itself constantly being conquered. There is no pre-contact Britain. And this is going to be important. The island broke off from continental Europe around 6000 BCE, and people came to live there at some point, we don't really know when, probably by way of a land bridge from continental Europe. And we know very little about these people other than that they were initially hunter-gatherers who eventually adopted continental agricultural practices and settled down. But most people's history of Britain begins with the moment of its first conquest. But is it really its first? People were coming from the continent, right? Who was there first? The answer is no one. So these continental European people who became Britons were conquered by the Romans. In 55 BCE, Julius Caesar conquered Britain. Most people don't know this, but it's that far up is when it happened. And it wasn't exactly a simple occupation. Caesar comes to Rome, and it's about 100 years later that the Emperor Claudius conquers the sword of capital, but it's not really a country. It's a collection of loosely connected clans when Rome comes. And so in some ways, Rome forms the sort of first connected Britain because Rome is all about having connections between their settlements. It also doesn't mean peace. It basically means that for as long as Rome is there, the indigenous Britons, who are actually continental Europeans originally, were fighting back against them. And Rome, in the way they always did, was a machine and set about conquering not just through military power, but through cultural destruction. They rooted out even small outlying clans that you would think wouldn't matter. They did everything to destroy language and religious practice. They uprooted Druidism, which was not an organized religion, was just sort of loosely enacted set of practices. And in many ways, one of the reasons why we don't know much about these original continental European Britons is because Rome erased their culture and history. And then they left. Eventually, conflicts in the rest of Europe distracted Rome, and they ended their occupation around the year 500 Common Era. Not after they left construction. These are the Roman baths in the city of Bath. The lower area here that you see is the original Roman construction with the original plumbing that still works. And they left other signs of their presence in physical spaces throughout the island. Also culture, because of their beginning, a lot of roads in Britain today are still based on Roman roads. And Christianity, with the Christianization of the empire around the year 300, that began to make its way to Britain. Not comprehensively, but it began to. Okay, and then, so the Romans withdraw around the year 400, and around the year 500, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, a group of Germanic tribes, make their way to the island from continental Europe. The important thing to know about this is that they sort of begin to unite those island kingdoms that were not really even kingdoms into an even more cohesive whole than the Romans did. The other thing that's worth knowing is that it's, again, not a formal invasion. And this is sort of a mythological beginning. We don't entirely know about it, but I want to tell you in a moment the story of how the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came to Britain. But first I want to point something out, which is today we hear the words Anglo-Saxon, and we think it means British, right? Actually, no. The Angles and Saxons and Jutes are from specific areas in continental Europe. And so when we say Anglo-Saxon, we're actually speaking about, historically, these Germanic tribes that then conquered England. And where are those places from? It's Denmark, actually, mostly. Slight bits of what is now the Netherlands and Germany, slight bits of what is now France. But honestly, the Jutes and the Angles are mostly Danish who come and conquer England. The story about how they got there is important to Beowulf. According to the medieval historian Bede, known as the Venerable Bede, he tells us this myth about how they came to be. There was a British warlord named Vortigern who ruled over a large section of sort of Eastern England, what is now Eastern England. And he was having trouble maintaining his borders. He needed muscle, basically, to help maintain the borders. And so he invited these Germanic tribes to come to Britain, quote, on the condition that they protected the country. It sort of worked. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes did drive out the enemies that were threatening Vortigern's borders, but then they really liked it. This is a direct quote from the manuscript in 731. They engaged the enemy advancing from the north, and having defeated them, apparently easily, they sent back news of their success to their homeland, adding that the country was fertile and Britons cowardly. And so in a very short period of time, they come to occupy and fully integrate into the island. Now, in each of these cases, every occupation that happens in Britain lasts a long time and isn't as simple as an invading army comes over and tells you, now you're this thing. It always happens through integration and intermarriage. So the original Indigenous Britons, what little we know about them, very quickly became Indigenous Britons plus Romans. And when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came, they very quickly intermarried and integrated with the people there, and Britons became Indigenous Briton, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Jute Britons. Here you can see the pathways of where the different nations came. You see Jutland and Anglin coming to the southern part and the east coast of Britain, and the Saxons, which are coming from sort of Germany, France-ish, coming to the midsection. Just to reinforce, when I say England, I'm often speaking of actually Danish colonies in the island of Britain. Christianization came with the early Roman invasion, but it actually also sort of happened more purposefully after that. Around the year 550, there's a famous myth about the Pope seeing British slave boys in a market and was so struck by their beauty. This is the image that you see here from a stained glass window of this. Said, these children are so beautiful, we must go and convert the land where they are from. He said, Nod Angli said Angeli. These aren't Angles, right, but angels, because they're so lovely. Which is a really complicated origin story for what was eventually a major cultural takeover. But I also want to say this. We are often trained, at least I was when I read Beowulf in high school, to think of the Christianization of Britain as being in competition with pagan Britain, right? Whatever the original practices were of those Indigenous Roman, Britain, Anglo-Saxon Jutes, stood in contrast to the Christianity that was brought in from the South. And it's really not as simple as that. Although there was missionary work, the way we think of it, the way it happened sort of in the 19th century, the medieval period was much more comfortable with blended traditions and what we think of as syncretic practice. So while there were some Christian and some pagan people who sort of saw there being only one true way, for the most part, it seemed that there was a lot of willingness to operate out of both traditions simultaneously. Ethelbert became the first baptized Christian king in 601. His wife was already a Christian. He had married into a Christian family largely for political reasons, but they also weren't exclusively Christian. So in some ways, the Christianization of Britain is both about the theological changes that occurred and the cultural changes that occurred when that happened, but it's also about the way Christianity, the institution, linked Britain to the rest of the world in a way that that little island country off the coast never had been before. And what that meant is there becomes, with the introduction of Christianity, a major influx of people and influences from around the world into Britain. One really great example of this is Hadrian of Canterbury, who is born in Africa, is Black, becomes an abbot in Naples, gets specially commissioned by the Pope because he is such an expert translator and theologian and educator to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, basically the leader of the church, the organized church in England. And he says no because he is so dedicated to education. And what happens is he travels up and down the eastern coast of Britain in the 600s, establishing monasteries and training all of the clerics who eventually go on to train other people. He becomes essential in the establishment of English religious and educational practice that's still in place to this day. And he wasn't the only African who ended up in England in the very early medieval periods. Another example of how ideas and works ended up in Northern Europe at this time is the Lindisfarne Gospels, which maybe you have heard of or seen before. Here's an example of them. They're these unbelievably beautiful illuminated manuscripts made by hand at the Lindisfarne Abbey in Northeast England. And throughout these, it's a set of the four Gospels, the first four books of the Bible. It's written in Latin, and it has an interlinear Old English gloss, meaning the words are written in Latin, and then in between the lines, in tiny letters, are written the words in the vernacular, in the language spoken by most people at the time. And it has these full-page designs throughout the manuscript. And they got initially called carpet pages by historians because they kind of looked like carpets. It turns out that that was accidentally correct. There is increasing evidence that these designs are based on Coptic, meaning Egyptian Christian carpets that were brought to Northern Europe again, we're talking like the 600s-700s here, that are themselves based on Islamic prayer rugs. So the idea of England as being this place that's only English, or that is sort of isolated from the rest of the world and not connected, is just false from the beginning. And this is the thing that we're going to keep coming back to. Okay, so conquered by the Romans, conquered by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, and then conquered by the Vikings. Right? The Viking Age begins in 793 when Lindisfarne Abbey, where those Gospels were made, is sacked by Norse raiders. The Vikings raid England off and on for 100 years or so. They sort of become what I think of as like the medieval equivalent of snowbirds. Like they go to England in the winter because it's warmer, and then they're like, hey, you know what? This is actually great. We're gonna stay. And eventually they establish what's called the Danelaw, which is a Danish ruled kingdom on the island of Britain that occupied most of the island, and that eventually became so integrated that approximately 200 years later, a whole nother set of Viking raiders come to England to raid the Danelaw because it has so entirely become its own thing. It's no longer thought of as a Danish extension, it's become integrated. So in every one of these cases, occupation happens and then it sort of just gets wrapped into the culture of the island. And this is where things get a little funny and where the Danes come in more clearly, right? So the people we think of as the Anglo-Saxons are largely Danish mixed with whoever was there. And then the Vikings are sort of Swedish, Norwegian, but also largely Danish. And they conquer. And then they do it again. And then Knut the Great, who is the king of Sweden and Denmark and England, he owns this huge swath. They call it the North Sea Kingdom that he rules in the early 1000s. He then, it descends through like 3 generations through a group of people who are all Anglo-Dane until the Norman invasion in 1066. And this is where, like, if you've ever learned British history, it's like, this is where it begins with the Norman invasion. And so my question for you, this is the one point in the presentation where I'm putting you on the spot, is who are the Normans? Does anybody know?
Vikings in France.
They are Vikings in France. They are actually Danish-French invaders who come and invade the Danish-Roman Britons. So when we're talking about England, who are we talking about actually? This is a picture from the Bayeux Tapestry, which is the most important historical document of this event. It's entirely done in needlework. It's like 60 feet long. And it's also, this is fun, it's the first recorded instance of Halley's Comet appears in this tapestry. This is the death of Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Dane king of what was not yet even England, that was conquered by the French-Danish Normans, William the Conqueror in particular. Beowulf gets written in the midst of all of this. It's written in the late 700s, probably. It's a really unique document in all kinds of ways. But it is, I just wanted to situate it in history. We'll come back to it more in a minute. Because what I want to talk about is what all of this history of invasion means for the people who are living on the island of Britain as it happens. Who were they? How did they think of themselves? When I learned about Beowulf, I sort of thought of them as just like English people, but just the old versions. When you hear it spelled out like this at the Museum of Danish America, it can be very easy to feel like, well, they were all Danes, right? And it's a bit more complicated than both of those. So I want to talk about sort of what this means. A sense of where we can, a place where we can get a sense of how these people thought about themselves is in the archaeological finds that we have from this era. And one of the most famous of them is the burial mounds at Sutton in East Anglia. This is a set of burial mounds that was excavated in the 1930s. It had always been there. People knew it was there. There's evidence that it was, the burial mounds were raided throughout history, but never got to the sort of the best part of it. And then in the 1930s, serious excavation began. If you are interested in hearing this whole story, there's a really lovely movie on Netflix called The Dig about the history of how this happened. That's mostly accurate. You know, it's a movie. But what is discovered here is all kinds of evidence about the way people lived and what they valued at the time. What's especially interesting about the Sutton Hoo burial is that it is a complete ship burial, meaning they literally put a ship in the ground and used it as a tomb for the body of the person buried there. When it was excavated in the 30s, the wood had all disappeared. It had all disintegrated, but all of the iron rivets were exactly in place. So you can see here, essentially the negative space where the ship was, and it was filled with ritual artifacts telling us a little bit about the culture and the body that's buried there. Here are examples of some of the things that were found in the Sutton Hoo burials. This is a belt buckle. You can't see the back of it, but it is just as designed on the back as it is the front. This is like exceptional craftsmanship even for today, right? Let alone when this approximately happened in the very early medieval period. Also, tarry fragments were found in the ground that only recently, in the last few years, have they learned more about. They thought initially that it was tar used to make the ship watertight, and it possibly was, except this tar is not from Northern Europe. It's from around the Dead Sea. How did fragments of bitumen, this tarry substance, end up in a grave in Northern England in the 600s and 700s? The answer is, it's not a mystery. It's because there was a lot of connection between the world at that time. It was not as isolated as we think. And what does that mean for the people who lived then? How do we think of them? How did they think of themselves? Here's another example of something from Sutton, just because it's so incredibly beautiful. This is Cloisonne Garnet and Milfiori glass, both things that are very difficult to make. Here's an example of sort of the big find from Sutton, is this helmet. On the left, you see the fragments as they currently exist, and on the right is a reconstruction of the helmet there. A big question for the Sutton find is who is buried there? And there's a lot of suggestion. We don't know exactly, but it seems like it was a pagan burial for a Christian king. Specifically, they think it was a man named Heyveld, who ruled over the British Angle clans in what is now East Anglia. It's named after them, the sort of Germanic British area. And he was the first king in the area who formally converted to Christianity, while he also maintained 2 chapels in his personal home, one to Germanic pagan gods and one to Christ. And that wasn't seen as horrifically heretical. It might have been by a couple of clerics at the time. The historian who writes about him several hundred years later says this was a terrible thing that he had this. But at the time, it was part of a pretty typical religious practice. And what we see in this Sutton burial, the way in which there are things from all over the world and an emerging of religious practices and a merging of cultural practices here, is pretty typical of this time period. It's worth thinking about what it means for medieval identity. We today have a very clear sense of what we think ethnicity means, right? Literally in a place like this, we have a very clear sense of what we think ethnicity means. But I think often about how I was raised. So my mom is Swedish. Her maiden name was Tolberg. I grew up near Stromsburg, Nebraska, which is the Swedish capital of Nebraska. And that was a big part of our cultural heritage. There was, pickled herring at Christmas events and dollar horses, the whole thing. And it was only when I was older that I found out that actually a very small portion of my actual family background is Swedish. And when I said that to my mom, she said, "Oh yeah, Swede is the dominant gene." And I was like, we're actually Swiss. We're so much more Swiss than we are Swedish. And she's like, are you really? And I think that that's important to remember, is that we think that we know what ethnicity is, that, my mom saying, she framed it in terms of biological genetics, but in reality, the practice, the habits, the customs, the traditions of Sweden were the part that was important. It's not clear that medieval people thought of their identity in those terms. The things that we think make up ethnicity, like legal structure or religion or language or customs, were not at all unified, right? Today, to be Danish in America means you probably don't speak the language, but you know a little bit about it, and you know the foods, and you know the customs and the traditions. In medieval England, you might have a language that you spoke that was different from the customs that you practiced, which was different from the religion that you were a part of, that was different from the king who ruled you. And those things didn't line up the way we expect them to line up. It also means that there is no sense of a timeless, unchanging descent group. The Romans were there and then they left. They merged with the indigenous Britons. Then the Germanic tribes came in and then they merged and then they left. There wasn't a sense, the way we today will say, I am a Danish American. They did not have that sense of continual linear descent. Historian Robert Bartlett has this quote. I think it's very important. Medieval rulers could expect to preside over different legal and linguistic communities, and also over many different religious communities. It was only in very particular circumstances that it mattered which was which. We think of those things as being super important today. It does not seem to have had the same consequence. Bartlett also says, by the year 1500, which is the beginning of the Reformation era, right, one could say that an English speaker, a subject of the King of England, and an English man or woman were all synonyms. But that situation of reinforcing rather than overlapping identities was a rare case, even by 1500, and one which was far from common in the medieval period. So you might speak one language, be ruled by a king from another place, practice a different religion, and have a different descent or kinship group, and you didn't think of that as being strange or hybrid or atypical. Okay, what does this mean for Beowulf and for us and for English literature? Well, the story of Beowulf is actually not even set in England. It's set in Heorot, which you see right here on the sort of right between the Danish peninsula and the Scandinavian peninsula. My Swedish family comes from Malmö, so right there on the cusp. And if my mom had known that, she would have absolutely claimed we were descended from Beowulf. But she did not. It tells the story, here's your little recap, of a long hall that's built in the place in Heorot, that's the name of it, by a king Frothgar, who is king of the Scyldings, a Dane-ish group. So Dane-ish, what does that mean entirely? We're not totally sure. That as soon as they build this hall, this place of community for the Scyldings, for their small kinship group, immediately gets attacked by a monster. And the monster's name is Grendel. And he terrorizes them for 12 years until Beowulf, who is a hero, not a king, but a hero connected to the Gattish people who are up here, sort of Swede-ish territory, comes to help rid them of their monsters. It's a geographically and linguistically diverse text, as you can see, right? It's set in sort of Danish territory with a sort of Swedish hero, but it's written down in Old English, and there's every indication that the story existed in the oral tradition before it gets written down. And there are linguistic clues that are extremely boring, and I won't get into, but just trust me, that the version of Old English that it's written in is actually a translation of other Old English dialects. So the story has actually traveled in written versions, and before that it traveled in oral tradition, and before that, who knows? So like, where is it from is very hard to say. And that's even before you get into what did it mean to be from those places, not what we think it means today. So, knowing this about the complicated history of Beowulf shifts a couple of important things for you when you read Beowulf. And I just want to talk about a few of them today. It actually changes many, many things about the story, but we're just going to give you a taste. So do you remember the story about how the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came to England? That matters to Beowulf. The story of Beowulf is that of a kingdom that needs help protecting itself from an invader, much like the story of King Vortigern, who needed help protecting his borders. Heorot is under attack, and then, without invitation, a massive band of warriors appear on their shores, outfitted with the cutting edge of medieval weapons technology. And in fact, the poem takes like hundreds of lines to describe to you how amazing their weapons are. If you read the poem today, you know from the minute you look at the cover that Beowulf is the hero. And so it can be very easy to read that arrival as like, oh, thank goodness, Beowulf is here to save us from this terrible monster. But actually think about what it would mean to live in a relatively isolated community that is constantly being invaded, and then have a whole bunch of warriors show up unannounced and say, here we are, and look at our amazing weapons. If you read the story today, you can also feel like the greetings take forever, right? They'd spend a lot of time doing very formalized greetings. And when I first read the poem, I was like, oh, it must be that greetings are very important to these people. Very polite behavior is important to them. And it is. But what I also didn't realize is that when invaders show up on your shores covered in weapons, you maybe want to be really careful about how you let them in and figuring out who they are. And that a lot of what seems just like very officious and formal behavior is preemptive diplomacy. They are trying to figure out how to protect themselves if they need to. Especially in their weakened state, because they're constantly being attacked by this monster. The people at Heorot have every reason to believe that this unexpected band of warriors is there to be a threat to them. This is from a really lovely comic book version of Beowulf. And upon hearing Beowulf's offer of help, I'm here to help you destroy these monsters. And even after he destroys them, the people of Heorot really ought to be worried about Beowulf's plans because of the story of the coming of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They were mercenaries, which frankly is what Beowulf is. He's hired muscle. And the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were hired to protect against invaders from the north, probably Picts from Scotland, but there's a lot of references in the text of Beowulf that imply that the monsters who attack them are from Scottish-ish territories. The Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes do drive them out, just as Beowulf does the monsters. And that is exactly when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes realized that they were in a fruitful place full of people who could be easily conquered. So even once Beowulf defeats the monsters, and if you have no idea about British history, you read the story and are like, relief. To the characters in the story, dramatic tension has actually gone up because they realize that the threat of the monsters may be gone, but the threat of being taken over by the people you hired to protect you has only begun. There is no reason to believe that Beowulf will not take over Heorot for himself and conquer the king that he ostensibly seemed to help until he leaves. And this shows up in a bunch of different ways. Two parts of this are the way that we might think about Hrothgar, the king of Heorot, who hires Beowulf. He doesn't pay him in advance, he pays him after the fact, but it's clear that Beowulf expects compensation for what he does. In my experience, 21st century readers are very prepared to read King Hrothgar, who builds this beautiful hall for his people, as a good king. And in part, that's because the text tells you over and over again that he's a good king. In Old English, it is, that was good kinning, right? Like it's like straight up tells you he was a good king over and over. And because 21st century readers are largely not prepared to read irony into early English literature, we're like, oh, he was a good king. But think about it. If you're reading a historical account and they have to tell you over and over, he was a good king. He was a good king, you guys. Maybe you want to be a little skeptical of that. And when you think about the story of British history, it becomes even more troubling. The story tells us that this good king built a beautiful longhouse and then had it attacked by a terrifying monster almost the instant that it's done being created, and that the monster kills his closest kinsman, kills his most beloved thane. And then Hrothgar does nothing about it for 12 years, while Grendel continues to reave his way through their community. Again, the text tells us he was a good king, but as you're also getting this information about how he failed to protect his people, you have to wonder how good of a king was he really? And he doesn't even try to fight back against Grendel. There's no effort made. In fact, there's a funny moment in the story where we're told that the Thanes, his sort of warrior knights, sleep in Heorot every night, even though they know that Grendel's going to come and probably eat one of them. And every night, King Hrothgar goes and sleeps in the bothies, these little huts around the main hall, which is where women and children slept. And the text sort of says, oh, it made logical sense because he's the king and you don't want to endanger the king. He was a good king is one of the times when that shows up. And I think knowing what we know about what happened to King Vortigern and being prepared to read complications in medieval texts suggests to us that we ought not be uncritical of this king in this moment. And really begins to alter some of our readings of the poem. One of the other ways that this knowledge really shapes how we understand the text is how we understand the role of women in the poem. There are not a lot of women in this poem. It is very focused on the men. But there is one important woman who appears in the action of the text itself, and that is King Hrothgar's wife, Wealhtheow, which is just a simply beautiful name. And I would encourage all of you who may have children someday to consider naming your daughter Wealhtheow. I encourage all of my Old English classes to take this up. I have yet to have an alumni with a daughter named Wealhtheow, but I can keep trying. Okay, Wealhtheow appears at a feast scene after Beowulf has conquered the monsters and they are celebrating his victory. She shows up and passes around a ceremonial cup. And this was sort of the primary ceremonial action of women in this long haul world, was to carry the cup from the Lord to his men and serve both as a visual and human reminder of the wealth of that king. She is, in the poem, is described, more time is given to the description of her clothes and her jewelry than any other part of her. But she's something more. And so I think 21st century audiences can read her very much as a walking billboard / waitress. And instead, she's up to something far more complicated than that. One of the reasons why medieval people had such hybrid identities was the way that marriage was used to broker allegiances between different clans, people with a shared leader, between different kinship groups, people with shared ancestry, between religious groups, between groups defined by geography or language. So often it was marriage that allowed these connections that eventually became sort of development of later culture. And that meant that women played a very important role in creating peace. In fact, Wealhtheow is often called the peacekeeper in the poem, but it also meant that women were where fissures began, because imagine being in the position of being married off to the people who have killed your family members in order to create an alliance between them. And there are 3 separate stories in Beowulf. The only 3 stories that are told within the poem about women are of women who either could not maintain peace between their family of origin and the family they had been married into, or who on purpose sought to end peace between their family of origin and the family they had been married into, because they would not countenance further murdering of their own people. So when Wealhtheow, the only woman who's not connected to any of those stories, shows up, it matters. Also, look at what she says when she walks this cup around the room. First, she speaks to her husband, and I think this is important too. It can sound like she's offering just praise to him, but this is what she says. "Enjoy this drink, my most generous lord. Raise up your goblet, entertain the Gats," meaning Beowulf's people, "duly and gently, discourse with them, be open-handed, happy and fond, relish their company. But recollect as well all of the boons that have been bestowed upon you." First of all, notice that she's being instructional, right? If this is praise, it's very leading. The bright court of Heorot has been cleansed, and now the word is that you want to adopt this warrior as your son. So while you may bask in your fortune and then bequeath kingdom and nation to your kith and kin before you decease, I am certain, so I want to pause there. This is also the first time in the poem that you hear about the possibility of Frothgar adopting Beowulf. You have no clue that this is happening until all of a sudden she says, I've heard this rumor that you're going to adopt this stranger as your son and give him our kingdom. And she says, you may, I love this line, while you may, and I always expect the next part to be like, while you may do that if you want to. Instead, she says, while you may bask in your fortune, right? You can have all this wealth. Remember what it means. Remember your kith and kin. And then she says, I'm certain that Hrothulf is a nephew to the king, who you've never heard of before in the poem, except to hear that he's a nephew. He is noble, and he will use the young ones well. He will not let you down. Should you die before him, he will treat our children truly and fairly. He will honor, I am sure, our two sons. He will repay them in kind when he recollects all the good things we gave him once, the favor and respect he found in his childhood. So she says to her husband, I hear that you're going to adopt this stranger who's incredibly powerful and make him your son, which means he'll someday be our king. Isn't it wonderful that we have this nephew who, if our very young children are not old enough to rule, right? If the nephew is alive when you die, he will be the protector of our children because he will remember all the good things we did for him now. That's so subtle, but we're Midwesterners, right? I think in some ways Midwesterners are very well equipped to hear subtlety when someone is being polite, but there's a little something else beneath that. Because what she's saying is, we have a person in place to rule if our children are too young to rule when you die. And we've given him all kinds of favors, and he's going to remember those if we ever need him to do this job. And implied in that is, what if you bypass him? Not only will our sons be disinherited, but we're going to have this angry nephew, who we know is a great warrior because that's why we made him guardian of our sons. And if you are like, oh, actually, no, I'm giving our kingdom to that guy, might not be very happy about it. She is reminding him both of his own children who he would disinherit and of the political strife that would happen if that's what he did. And then she turns to the bench where her boys sat, Hrethric and Hrothmund, more good names for you to add to your list, and with other nobles' sons, all the youth together, and that good man, Beowulf the Gad, who sat between the brothers. Now, we know that her children are like under 10 because of where they are in the hall, but Beowulf is sitting between them. And do you remember what Beowulf looked like? He's a huge superhero-looking dude. And so on the bench are her tiny children and this massive guy in between them. And somehow her husband needs her to tell him, he's a threat to your children. He's not a person you should just like hand the kingdom over to. And then the cup is carried to him, kind words are spoken in welcome, all of these things. Then she speaks to Beowulf. She carries the cup over to Beowulf and says, she gives him a beautiful necklace, a torque that the poem spends a whole lot of time describing because the poem loves jewelry, as we all. She says, take delight in this torque, dear Beowulf. Wear it for luck, and also this mail from our people's armory. May you prosper in them. Be acclaimed for strength, for kindly guidance to these two boys, and your bounty will be sure. Which again, can you hear that there's some like very subtle but strong implications in there? You will be acclaimed for strength, of course, but also wouldn't it be great if you were acclaimed for kindly guidance of two children who need your help? And if you are acclaimed for kindly guidance, your bounty will be sure. We're giving you wealth now, absolutely. But if you continue to be good to us, how much more will you potentially someday get? She says, you have won renown. You are known to all men far and near, now and forever. Your sway is as wide as the wind's home, as the sea around the cliffs. And so, my prince, I wish to you a lifetime of luck and blessings to enjoy this treasure, which I also think sounds a little bit like, you've got enough, right? You're already so famous. What do you need to be king of? Treat my sons with tender care. Be strong and kind. Here, each comrade is true to the other, loyal to Lord, loving in spirit. The thanes have one purpose. The people are ready. Having drunk and pledged together, the ranks do as I bid. Here, each comrade is true to the other is a reminder to a stranger in their midst what their values are. Loyal to Lord, loving in spirit. It's telling him how he should be when he is there. And it is reminding him of how they are, whether he's there or not, loyal to the Lord. The thanes have one purpose. The people are ready. Ready for what? And then she says, having drunk and pledged together, meaning they've all drunk from this cup I've given them, including now you have too, the ranks do as I bid. You are now part of our community. We've integrated you in, and the rule is when you drink from the cup, you have to do what I say. So please, don't disown my children. But also, again, there is an implied threat. If you don't, everyone is at the ready to do what I say. So Wealhtheow is not simply a very well-dressed waitress. She is brokering peace for people when her husband is making reckless decisions. And knowing a bit about how this culture operated and how they thought of their identities, the idea that she could be saying, you are one of us now, but also don't disinherit my children, is very much in keeping with people who have a hybridized identity, and one that is not even thought of as hybrid, but sort of automatically operates that way. This means lots of things for English literature, but the one question that I always leave my students with, and that I want to leave you with today, is what does it mean for English literature if the foundational text of English literature is not English at all? But it's also not Danish. It's something else. How often have we thought of our literary tradition as being defined by national identity? What would happen if we begin to decouple our literary traditions away from nationhood in the way that medieval people thought of their artistic traditions and their religious traditions and linguistic traditions as decoupled from nationhood? How would that change the way we think about what it means to be English speakers or to be people who read English literature? I don't have easy answers to that, but I hope that we will have a chance to think and talk more about that today. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about Beowulf. Happy to answer questions if anyone has questions, or I'll just drink my water and chat with you. Of course, I would be very happy to repeat any questions if anyone has questions. Yes.
In terms of Beowulf as a text, in the last millennium, what are the ebbs and flows of Beowulf even being known?
Oh, so this is a great question. And if I had a whole other presentation to give, I would tell you all about a man named Sir Robert Cotton, who was a book collector. You know, we all have people in our communities who have very weird hobbies. Just like extremely weird hobbies, and everyone is just like, I don't know, that's them. That's what they do. They have this strange hobby. My grandfather makes mailboxes out of old farm parts that look like fully accurate to scale tractors. Yes, he was on the cover of the John Deere catalog in like 2003. It was a very big deal. But it's an extremely weird hobby, but he loves it and it makes him very happy. Sir Robert Cotton was like my grandfather, except for making farm tractor mailboxes that are perfectly to scale. He collected Old English manuscripts in the 1500s. By the 1500s, so about 700 years approximately after much of this is written, it was just being thrown away. No one cared about it because nobody spoke Old English, hardly at all. Very few people did. Well, no one spoke it, no one read it. It's a fully dead language by the 1500s. And so, other than the collection kept by Robert Cotton, one of the sources of Old English writing is in Renaissance era books where people used Old English manuscripts as scrap paper. And they would paste them into the covers of books when they were recovering them. And now historians are like, oh, thank goodness, that's how they saved that one piece of paper for us. But Robert Cotton, almost everything we have that's written in Old English today comes from his collection. So in some ways, Beowulf is written in the late 700s, and then it disappears from the historical record until it shows up in Robert Cotton's library. Except we know that because it existed in the oral tradition, versions of it were still circulating, but the actual manuscript of it is first of all, in manuscript. There are no other copies of it. And it was just, we don't know really where it was before it ended up in his library. Cotton's library is so important to the study of Old English that every medieval manuscript, except for the ones that are just like random scraps that are found places, are named after. His library was a big room. Actually, this is the perfect room to explain what it was like in. So imagine that instead of these panels, every one was a bookcase. And then on top of every bookcase, he had a bust, like those sculptures that are just head and shoulders, of a different classical person. And every medieval manuscript today is named after what bookcase it was on. So Beowulf is MS for manuscript, MS Cotton from the Cotton Library, Nero from the Nero bookshelf, and then the following numbers are what shelf it was on. And that's still the organizing principle we use today. And at one point the library got caught on fire, but almost everything was saved. If it wasn't, we would have nothing. Like there would be no knowledge of Old English as a language or a literature. But starting in the Renaissance, right, rebirth, there was an interest in the origins of English literature. And this also connects very much to the move from England of being culturally marginal to England saying, we're important and our literature is important. Arguing for the value of English literature became an important part of English nationalism in the Renaissance era and then through the Enlightenment. There are really fascinating things about medieval, late medieval, like Chaucer era, European poets saying no one can write good poetry in English. Just the language is not capable of writing good poetry. And so Chaucer actually actively started to write poetry in English to refute this. And then later poets were like, we have a history, our language matters, we have this long tradition of poetry. And that's when Beowulf sort of came back into being widely circulated in the public imagination. And that's when the first versions of it were printed. So anyway, thanks Robert Cotton for your weird hobby. Maybe someday my grandpa's mailboxes will become very important as well.
You showed a picture of what I assume was the original.
Yes, yeah.
Have you seen it?
I have not actually seen it in person. Although I did, here, I'll pull it back up. I did take, gosh, I can't even remember now if it was 2 or 3 years of Old English so that I could read it in person, or read it in the original. And this is also one of the things, I don't get into this, the history of English as a language is very fascinating. And it is absolutely influenced by this history of weird invasion that's constantly happening. But Old English is a fully separate language from the version of English that we speak. It sounds more like German than English. Its grammar is fully different than contemporary English. You wouldn't recognize it. On my very first day of class, our professor showed up and recited the first 50 lines of Beowulf to us in Old English without telling us what he was doing. And we all just sort of sat there in shock and fear, feeling like, oh, should I know what's happening? And no. But so yeah, even being able to read it, German speakers did a little better than people who were based in Romance languages with Old English, but yeah, I've not seen it. Maybe someday.
Where is it?
Good question. It's in the UK somewhere. I want to say that it's at the British Library, but I don't know off the top of my head. I will also say I could never see it. You would need all kinds of, one of the really interesting things about studying old manuscripts is that they are very expensive if you steal them and sell them on a black market. So the most exciting, the closest to feeling like a spy I've ever been was when I went to the Huntington Library in California, which is, there's like 3 major manuscript libraries in the United States where they hold ancient and medieval documents. And when you walked into this library, a security guard like checked all of your pockets, and you couldn't bring a bag in. You could only bring in non-mechanical pencils. You couldn't bring in anything else with you. The most dangerous, like they would not allow you in if they found a string in your pocket, because strings are how people cut old manuscripts. And then while I was in the library, librarians would have to go and get everything and bring it to me. All I did was sit there, and I was audio taped and videotaped and physically watched the entire time I was in the room. And I was not actually looking at that like expensive of things, although at the end of my visit, I did call up a letter that had been signed by Queen Elizabeth I so that I could like touch something very fancy. And so I can't imagine that I also had to have multiple letters of introduction even to be able to go there. And so I can't imagine, even as a like lifelong scholar of Beowulf, that I would be allowed to see the original Beowulf manuscript. Luckily, scanning is very good right now. And I think about how different my career is because I'm able to see scanned versions of documents than it would have been even 20, 25 years ago. Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question about ethnicity. So you mentioned that during this period, people didn't have the same view of ethnicity and identity that we do today.
Yeah.
Around when did that kind of more, I guess, firm sense of like these characteristics are associated with this group? When did that emerge?
Sure. So the question is, if in the sort of early medieval period, people in England didn't have a clear sense of, or sorry, not clear. They had a very different sense of identity that wasn't dependent on a sense of aligned language, custom, kinship, heritage that we do today. When did that come into practice? I can only speak to England, right? Because in some ways, because England is geographically marginal, things that, so a really great example is the Renaissance. The Renaissance happens in Italy several hundred years before it gets to England. And so I don't know when in the rest of Europe that sort of sense of unified identity began. I mean, I would say that in the classical period, Romans have a very distinct sense of family, language, kinship, all of that into their sense of Romanness. But in terms of Britain, it's only by the beginning of the Tudor period, and even sort of around the beginning of the Reformation, that began to unify. And in part, the Reformation spurred that along because suddenly you're having to define yourself as being a reformer or not, in a way that before that was, not such a question. But that's also, it was the Tudors that began to really centralize power in a way that before, you know how in the United States we have regional identities as Midwesterners, as Iowans, as I live up in the northeast corner of this state, which is geographically very, very different than here. If you've never been, it's so lovely. It's the part of the Midwest that the glacier that smoothed everything else out just never got to. So it's very craggy, and we have waterfalls in town and things like that. We have a very clear sense of ourselves as Northeast Iowans, right? But we're also Americans, right? And so then you have these layers of identity, even within national identities. And I think that in England, before the Tudor period, people had a much clearer sense of themselves regionally, locally. But the Tudor period saw a bunch of big changes that began to shape identity into being, ethnicity into being a more unified thing. And one was the government centralizing, which was a result of Henry VIII making everyone Protestant all of a sudden. There was also a major population spike at that time and a huge rise in urbanization. Before the 1550s, most people stayed in the area where they grew up, and so there was no anonymity. This also has to do with the development of surnames in English. People just didn't have surnames because why would you need them? You lived in a village with 400 people, and when they were talking about you, they knew who you were. But there's, in some ways, anonymity becomes a thing that can be a part of your life for the very first time in England around the 1550s. And that's also when identity begins to sort of shape up in that way. So I could keep talking for so much longer, and I will talk more tonight. Thank you so much for being a really attentive audience on a weird esoteric topic. I appreciate it. And if you have not read Beowulf, it's really great. You should go read Beowulf. There are lots of great translations. I love the Seamus Heaney translation is my favorite. Wonderful Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, also a fantastic translator. So, thank you.
Thank you.